although they should be related somehow.
Yeah,
But you're right. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. So that's one action. Yeah. Then another big action is going to be.
Well, maybe we could go to that. We thought that the GAPAD Secretariat could maybe raise improved research agendas.
Yes, something in that area. Yeah.
Develop
We were saying what
recommendations.
we were talking about asking what does agricultural diversification research look like,
That's right.
and what I guess making the case for investment in it. I think somebody said.
This is the recommendation to target the investment towards agriculture. And you can easily see the area where there are wastage of resources and so on. So then the recommendation we just want to make this investment more strategic. Yes.
No, that's right.
When we talk about investment, research and extension, right?
Exactly. Yes. John?
Well, it's just saying the hypothesis in the first one is that you just have
to be part of AD guidelines and principles.
it's MNE.
It's down
No, I think it's actually. Is it?
center, yeah. I think it
No, this is
was-
defining, isn't it? This is sort of saying.
Yeah, it's defining.
When we said agricultural productivity, what criteria are we going to measure that against? So where would that go? Is it?
So this is the kind of M&E.
Yeah, I think it's
We need
somewhere
to
there.
define things for the week.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. Okay.
Incentivize input suppliers, for example, agricultural diversification crop seeds.
I think that's budget
This-
change.
Ways to reduce hunger and child malnutrition, and increasing women's income and economic empowerment is more directly related to reducing child nutrition and food security of the entire household. And then the main issue, and this is where we come to data, evidence, and research-based policies, that there hasn't been as much rigorous research that can show this and be embedded in policy communication and policy research that can then be communicated upstream. And so one of the main focuses that they've been working on in the past few years is a new tool, Women's Empowerment Index. I encourage you to read about it more. Some resources down here, but it's based on primary data focused on the household and looking at women's empowerment. And the idea is to quantify women's empowerment, which can then be related to certain policy interventions and then certain outcomes, whether it's household well-being or hunger and malnutrition. There's two really good articles of interest, one from Ethiopia, another one from Nepal. And I encourage you to dig through that a bit more as we move forward.
Start linking with climate change funds to get carbon credit to smallholder farmers for diversified and sustainable agricultural practices.
Comments?
That's part of that. It's a mechanism for that. Value addition, village level agro-processing industries. This question here is okay. By 2017, develop networks of international multilateral sectoral expertise. By 2017, establish secretariat to coordinate and cover.
Who wrote this?
Which is that? To coordinate and coverage
Converge.
Converge. Coordinate and converge. Congested efforts, okay, I see what you mean. For implementing agricultural diversification. So it's coordination.
It's like setting up of it.
Something like probably. Establish an agricultural diversification fund which can be accessed by input and service providers to support agricultural diversification crops grown by farmers.
Yeah.
So this is a mechanism to
It's good.
facilitate
Good
markets.
Yeah.
Do risk and benefit assessment for adoption of AD crops by small-scale farmers.
That's
Agricultural diversification interventions. You can't do everything everywhere at the same time.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, 3 more pins. Schedule.
Is that? Do we have a planning? Is there a planning area?
Well, in as much as the task force is planning, it's sort of here.
Yes.
Are there any more?
no, there are no more things, so it's stopping there.
Well, that's enough. Well done.
So we've got a task force section and planning. We've got a farmer level and indexes section. We've got a input and output market sort of section, including finance. We've got an evidence-based convincing investors, policymakers, etc.
So the task now would be, so for example, they take one grouping, take the top right-hand corner, the convincing policy line. The question then is, a question we could ask is, firstly, are any of them just simple duplication? Or secondly, do some seem to feed into others? In other words, they would be sub-actions under the key action. And we can look in such a way that would reflect that hierarchy or duplication. And then what I suggest is when we look at that, we look carefully now at each of these, not at a rush, but carefully think about how they relate to the others. That has to then perhaps have one dedicated good
Talking about we improve nutrition, there was not any nutritionist in the room there. But at least it's an initiative I think that we can also link with, and at least if we have to be the platform that looks who is doing what, that needs to mark in that.
That's a useful action, being at least an understanding of who are the different actors. In this.
there's so
And
many.
a qualification would be useful for that.
And if I may be dreaming, we'll have to look at two sides. There's nutrition and there's agricultural biodiversity people. And both of them, ABD people sometimes want to say something about nutrition. Nutritionists sometimes want to say something about ABD. But if I may comment those that are really working on the connection between, but also
Extreme men.
bring those two sides of people together. Because it's true, when you participate in the meetings here at the Ministry of Health, they know that they have to look at agriculture and they know that, but there's nobody who knows how to do it.
So Prime Minister is facilitating a forum where these two groups meet together.
But again, that is changing now because now all of a sudden everybody's talking nutrition. Every meeting I go to, because they have never known any nutritionist. But all of a sudden they are talking nutrition, and so this is an opportunity
it's an
now,
opportunity to bring them together.
to come together.
I think the will is there, it's just not yet facilitated enough.
This is new. This is new, really.
That's a niche area for us. Champion and facilitate.
Yeah.
Since we're brainstorming amongst ourselves, the question was asked, so what do we do that's not old wine in new bottles? Everyone's done it before with 150 people in a room. And nobody really knew what the plan was. Everyone was there. So the plan was announced before there was a real discussion. 350 people told, right, we're going to talk about maize systems, rice systems. So we went down the list of crops for climate resilience or climate smart agriculture. And the people who really were vociferous were the farmers groups. So the farmers groups said, but this is what we already do. What are the alternatives that you can help us with that gives us climate smart? So we shouldn't fall into that trap of
People who voted for the position now is to present friends outside. Now and there will be a lot of there will. That's how it works.
But I agree about asking questions, okay? It's time for all of us to become part of that group. So now we're throwing it out, and you're all now part of that breakout group. So if you have a suggestion, a comment, or a question, then of course, please make it. And I know each of the groups will accept that input, welcome it, and will take it into consideration, and certainly will be taken into consideration in the overall.
So, it's a pointer? Oh, it's here. Good afternoon once again. Did we have too much lunch? Yeah. We look like. So, what we did in our group, we came up with about 4 or 5 points that are contributing to the 2.1, 2.2 targets. And the targets, would you like us to remind you the targets? Or you already know them for the other group? We have the target somewhere. So the target 2.2, 2.1 is to, by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe, nutritious and sufficient food all year round. So yesterday, you remember how we unpacked a few things. So today we were looking at those recommendations. So one, we said GAPAD could be a source of evidence-based data, or can provide that. And one of the key things we said is the food composition table. We acknowledge that FAO is supporting countries to come up with the food composition data, so GAPAD's role would be to support sort of encourage the countries to use these food composition tables to ensure that there is consistency across the globe in terms of the methodologies used. And the other activity around the evidence is within the 1 year, GAPAD to identify the areas for food consumption studies, and within a period of 5 years, work or do research around the food consumption studies. Because what we find is we do not have sufficient food consumption data that can support most of the recommendations, especially around the food composition tables. The other recommendation area that we thought that we need agricultural diversification to be mainstreamed within government investment plans. This should fit within existing government policies. Some of those policies are the nutrition-focused organizations, some of them being the SUN, the Reach Zero Hunger 1,000 Days, just to mention a few. And the process should be ongoing. And then as GAPAD, we would develop a strategy at different stages and at different regions or countries to increase resilience and farm a community in the climate change situation. And we could pilot this with one country, and this we suggest that it should start by 2018. And the other is identify respected persons at different levels, right from the grassroots, from the political arena, from the academia, to champion nutrition. And then the other activity or plan is to develop a policy paper to look at the integrated nutrition in agricultural diversification. Next, we looked at the indicators and we thought the indicators are great, but they're not exhaustive. So we suggested that we could develop a set of complementary indicators to look deeper into nutrition issues. So this would be country specific, and we could have a generic sort of intermediate or intermediate outcome indicators. Case in point are dietary diversity, dietary intake indicators, looking at the dietary diversity scores to understand and also to help in understanding the different sources of nutrients. So these are the issue of indicators, and we propose to have this by 2018. The other recommendation we had is to have a holistic and balanced agricultural diversification process, whereby we would like to have a promotion of a wholesome dietary diversity approach as opposed to a single nutrient, and also identify a range of locally available foods that can meet the nutrient requirements within the given regions. In the same time, consider food safety issues, the zoonoses and hygiene issues, because we know they do equally contribute to malnutrition. The other is understand who are the actors in nutrition and coordinate with them. This is to bring together different nutrition actors or sectors. This could be the ministries of agriculture, education, health. See how we can convene or have a set of a place where they can meet and have the discussions as a team, instead of working in silos as we had yesterday. The other is GAPAD. We acknowledge that SDG 17 is important, but to this meeting this target, it will be also important. So we need to identify strategic partnerships and work towards re-energizing them to work towards nutrition outcomes. The other important one is the women empowerment, as we had as we all know that if women are supported with resources, with education, they have a significant role in the nutritional or dietary intakes of families, and especially children. So GAPAD's role would be to identify how to support these women with technologies and how to get more income. But more importantly, the technology should not be pilots, but they should be tried and tested and working technologies. So work towards upscaling the tried technologies. The other is so we acknowledge that GAPAD has potential to link countries to these technologies which have worked elsewhere. So they could be used or contextualized according to the situation on the regions or the different countries. The other component is youth empowerment, capacity development to re-energize agriculture among the youth. This is just an example across the value chain, looking at the machineries, the markets, and different technologies, because we realize that most youth do not want to engage in agriculture because they think it's not good, it's not sexy, as the group said. It's not me who said that. So we need to repackage it to look sexy, to have the youth appreciate it and take it, because we know they can also be a significant source of labor towards along the value chain, and they are eventually parents or people who will influence nutrition in their countries. Yeah, that was all about.
Thank you.
Keep your microphone. Right. Is this working? Yes, good. Rightio. Well, that was a little shorter than the 15 minutes, so please centre stage. Which gives us a little bit more time for if anyone would like to talk about any of these. So with the two targets sitting in front of you and reminding yourself of what this group was working towards. Yes. Yeah. We should have another microphone floating around here somewhere, do we? There we are.
Just in terms of sort of framing, in essence, the GAPAD target in the area of nutrition, it seems in your presentation that you're assuming that dietary diversity is a subcomponent of agricultural diversity, as opposed to agricultural diversity contributing to improvements in dietary diversity and therefore potentially nutrition. So is it a part of, or does it contribute to what is sort of an external objective?
Right. If I get you right, the assumption is agricultural diversification will contribute to dietary diversification, to dietary diversity. Yeah. And therefore, dietary diversity has opportunities to improve nutrition. I don't know if I am answering correctly or I understood.
Agricultural diversification. Do we frame it in the sense that nutritional diversity is a part of agricultural diversity, that diversification?
It benefits.
Or does it contribute to dietary diversity?
Agricultural diversification contributes to dietary diversity.
Okay. So, okay.
All right.
Is there anyone else from dark green group would like
Somebody to
jump in? Donna, can we have someone with the microphone, please?
I think John's point is important because there's so much more to agricultural diversification than merely providing diets. I mean, there are environmental impacts, etc., sociological impacts. The one thing that perhaps didn't come out of the presentation as strongly as I'd like to see is that the target indicators for SDG 2.1 and 2.2 are frankly feeble. And so to be able to in fact have target indicators that are more specific, more reasonable, more comprehensive would be a very positive thing for GAPAD to produce. So the current two target indicators are only dealing with undernutrition, for example.
Yeah, we do acknowledge that that target 2.2 also refers to the World Health Assembly target of 2025, which looks at overweight, looks at wasting, looks at breastfeeding, looks at stunting, all that. So we thought that agricultural diversification could answer that, but we also agree that yes, we need to develop what we thought would be like immediate outcome indicators, because what we already have are very high level, but we need at this level of very specific indicators to help us reach to those high level indicators. I don't know if somebody from the group would like to.
Just want to say, Esther was also our secretary. I think she didn't even anticipate presenting, so we are grateful to her. She's also presenting. But coming back to here, to say agricultural diversification may lead to diversified diets, and may also lead to better nutrition. We've seen malnourished children in the midst of a lot of food. So it has to be accompanied by nutrition education. Yeah. And then one thing we kept saying it must run through in view of the SDGs is the partnership issue. So even where we can do that, we must partner. And it's a great opportunity for us now also to focus on nutrition, since other research bodies have not even focused on nutrition before, and the kinds of crops they promote do not have much nutrition. Yeah.
And also to jump in a bit and beside, nutrition education, using social behavior change approaches, and where partnerships will need the media to pass this information, and of course different other channels of communicating. So behavior change, also a key component of enhancing the nutrition education.
So in essence, it would seem the group has recognized that agricultural diversification and the production of nutritious food at the production level won't guarantee nutrition outcomes necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But what we can conclude is that if you are not producing nutritious food, nothing else you do will give you a nutrition outcome. So that's a prerequisite, but it's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the question that you were asking? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Please do jump in.
Then it seems to me, in terms of actually defining the GAPAD target within this SDG 2 target, potentially could be framed as understanding how, or the mechanisms through which agricultural diversification therefore contributes to improved nutrition, potentially through improvements in dietary diversity. So you get a much more specific framing, I mean, just as you presented this morning, much more specific framing of how GAPAD sees the sort of nutritional target in the SDG target.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I'm sure Dark Green Group would be very happy to consider. Sorry.
It's really only to open it up for the whole group, and I'm speaking personally, but if you say women and youth empowerment, is that something we take across everything we do, or do we look at particular targets here where there's a particular reason? Nutrition, in this case, is specific and very appropriately related to women, and in some cases, though I'm not quite so clear, where the youth empowerment relates specifically to nutritional diversification. Farming, yes, but in this particular case, what's the advantage? So I just want us to be aware that we don't want platitudes, we want specific reasons why women empowerment should be in this section and not across everything, or should it be across everything? And I think at the end of the afternoon we may want to come back to these generic statements that are cross-cutting, and which of those are cross-cutting, or which of those should be in particular places in this, so that we've got a reason why that's a particular group that's going to have an advantage.
Can I ask for presentation, please? That's Keith. I think we're going to have to plug your laptop into the LCD. Okay?
Sorry, forward rather backwards. Okay, good afternoon. I also was the secretary who became the presenter, and I'm also losing my voice. So we looked at targets 2.3 and 2.4, and first of all we developed GAPAD targets to shadow the SDG targets. So for the first one, SDG target 2.3, this was by 2030 double the agricultural productivity and the incomes of small-scale food producers. There was some more detail, but that's the gist of it. Our GAPAD target, based on that, is by 2030, agricultural diversification is making a critical contribution to the doubling of agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. So it's very similar, but it's focusing on the agricultural diversification elements. Similarly with 2.4, the original target in its shortened form is by 2030 ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilient agricultural practices. Our GAPAD target then became by 2030 sustainable food production systems and resilient agricultural practices are achieved with agricultural diversification making a critical contribution. So they're both very similar, they both mirror the original, and we tried to make them simple as we possibly could. Oops. We then, can you open that up? Yeah, we then brainstormed on what sort of activities would be needed to achieve either or both of those GAPAD targets. And having brainstormed on activities, we then sorted them into groups to see what sort of activities we should tackle. And they quite neatly came into, I think it's 5 titles. One we titled Policy and Evidence, one we titled Planning and Coordination, one we titled Operational Practices, one we titled Commercialization, and one we titled Monitoring and Evaluation. So if we just go up to and then for each one we tackled it by a what and a when by. We didn't necessarily get into who and the various other categories. That's fine, thanks. So under our Policy and Evidence heading, and we put these in chronological order. So by 2017 we said we should develop and publish GAPAD guidelines and principles on agricultural diversification. And this would include defining the terms used in SDG 2. And these were the terms we were grappling with yesterday. Also by 2017, we would develop and publish a 2-page policy brief, which was based on those guidelines and principles, for distilling that information for busy policymakers, investors, who wouldn't necessarily wade through that big document. By 2019, we're suggesting the UN would host an international conference on agricultural diversification, UNCAD, UN Conference on Agricultural Diversification. And at this conference, we envisage that governments would pledge support to an agricultural diversification fund, which we'll come to later on. So by 2022, we also suggested that a protocol will be proposed to the Convention on Biological Diversity, is that right? On agrobiodiversity specifically, which I understand is currently absent or quiet in that. So that was our specific actions on policy and evidence. Can we go to the coordination and planning? So coordination and planning. Right away, 2016, mirroring the energy example we saw this morning, we should recognise the Roundtable Forum, i.e. this group, as the GAPAD SDG2 task force. By 2017, GAPAD Secretariat to establish and coordinate a network of international, regional and national organisations with sectoral experience in agricultural diversification. By 2022, GAPAD signatory countries will have lodged national action plans on the contribution of agricultural diversification to the achievement of SGA 2030 SDG 2 for their countries. And in support of this, GAPAD will explore and document successful agricultural diversification practices, will carry out risk and benefit analysis of agricultural development practices for small-scale farmers, and develop and adapt a range of agricultural diversification models that could be scaled up. So those outputs will then inform those national action plans. A knowledge management category, by 2023, we're suggesting establish a global agricultural knowledge base that provides data and knowledge on target, neglected and underutilized species. And this global global agricultural knowledge base will be continuously expanded and improved as a global project under a coordination body. So it's an ongoing thing. Under monitoring and evaluation, as 2017, we would define the criteria against which agricultural productivity will be measured. If we're going to double agricultural productivity, we've got to define what that means. And also by 2017, we're going to develop and publish a monitoring and evaluation roadmap, which includes tools, approaches, events, and responsibilities. By 2018, we're suggesting developing a global agricultural index with easily understandable scales for sustainability, agri-biodiversity, and nutrition. Onto operational practices, which are largely farmer-level things. So by 2022, develop and publish international standards for ISFM, IPM, and agri-water management. So this is kind of best practices for these different principles, or whatever you want to call them, approaches, and specifying the contribution that can be made by agricultural diversification. By 2025, implement agricultural diversification measures that will reduce post-harvest and storage losses to 30% or less. I understand they're currently 40%, so it's quite a big reduction, which we think would have a big impact. And by 2030, 30% of small-scale food producers, which includes farmers, fishers and forest folk, will have adopted agricultural diversification practices. And this will be done through, for example, activities to raise awareness amongst these people and enabling access to the inputs and knowledge they need to be able to implement them. Commercialization, this is largely input and output markets. So 2018, identify and document measures to incentivize input supply channels to support agricultural diversification. By 2018 again, develop a roadmap to strengthen markets and value addition opportunities for agricultural diversification crops. Here we're very conscious of not producing a large amount of new products or crops for which there's no market. 2019, this relates back to that UN international conference we talked about. So by 2019, we want to secure commitments at UN CAD, International Conference, to an agricultural diversification fund. And we envisage this would directly fund projects, businesses and organizations, but also be used to mitigate credit risk for microfinance and SACCO organizations. And we envisage this fund would be administered by an established international body, such as IFAD. I'm not saying it would be IFAD, but that sort of organization. And also by 2020, we're suggesting there should be links made with climate change funds to start getting carbon credits channeled to small-scale farmers implementing agricultural diversification initiatives. I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, I should have said, we were going to allocate activities to the two GAPAD targets, but we realized they were all relevant to both targets, so we didn't differentiate. All of them would be needed for both target 2.3 and 4.
Well, thank you very much to that group for the work that went into that, and it was very comprehensive. Obviously, some of you would have had to have taken notes, I suppose. So if you've done that and you could like to talk to anything specifically, we don't have a copy in front of you of it all, but if you did make a note and would like to raise a question or make a contribution, please. The floor is yours. Anybody? I noticed that the group didn't get to the point of identifying risks or suggesting mitigation for those risks, and I think that was simply a function of time, not intent. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact wording, but it struck me when you were talking about setting some targets, 30% increase in the adoption of agricultural diversification practices by smallholders. I think it's difficult to be absolute. I think we're dealing more with relative, whereas there needs to be more of a, what is, in any given context, what is the use of agricultural diversity and how do you improve the use of agricultural diversity? I'm not so sure it's possible to be so, you say, because smallholders are already practicing agricultural diversity. So I just found that one jarred a bit.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point, and I also was going to raise that one. So, thank you, because it's also you in setting targets need to consider how it would be measured. How would you measure that? you know, and even how do you define it? So, thank you. That's a good point. But Keith?
Yeah, well, I think we accept the point completely, and maybe if we'd got into how we would measure it and the indicators, we might have then started unpacking that.
Very good, thank you. And any other, and anyone from the group who would like to speak on any of the initiatives? We do have time allocated to you, so.
Just in the area of developing guidelines and principles for agricultural diversification, I assume that applies to sustainable increases in production, or is it broader than that, these guidelines and principles? And I guess the real question is, how did the guidelines and principles actually translate into how one thinks about achieving agricultural diversification, if you see what I mean? I mean, how do we move farming systems to, you know, increases in agricultural diversification?
Yeah.
Well, I think
quite happy for the group to.
If I may, I think that we need to be careful not to try and anticipate the content of the Guidelines and Principles Manual. So perhaps that's an incredibly good question that would then be put before the people who would then be developing the content of it, and an important question. Essentially, if I recall the conversation we had in the group, it was basically where there was consensus on what shouldn't be done, for example, and desirable practices that could be done, and where there was a need for terms to be defined. So, for example, double productivity. What do we mean by that? Against what criteria? Double productivity against land use? Double against what? So to think that through and actually spell out what we actually mean in the target in a guidelines and principles document. But I think the point you've raised is an excellent one, and that the people who then would come up and develop that would need to consider very much that type of question.
Issue of storage and post-harvest, we didn't know where to put it in our group, so we used the word holistic. But I think we should recognize there's a knowledge gap in terms of storing other crops, other species. We know how to do that, and we're learning how to do that with regard to major grains. But I think when we want a diversified diet of fruits and vegetables, I think that's still a real gap in knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you. There was quite a good discussion around that, in recognition that up to 40% of essentially product is lost in post-harvest handling, and I think the target actually sets a reduction target for that.
To 30.
To actually reduce it by 10%.
Yeah. We also, the group also suggested there's not only a knowledge gap, but there's infrastructure gap as well. So it's knowledge and resources.
Yes.
I'm glad you raised it, Ruth, also on storage and post-harvest. Even if we can reduce current post-harvest losses by 0.1%, if you multiply that by the volume of product that's lost every season, it's a huge saving. And going on from that, I mean, there are the stores that are available, quite a lot of them are used in monocropping systems. So that, for example, they're used for coffee. Well, the coffee's only in there for 2 months, 3 months of the year. And they're empty for the rest of the year. So if we can get more involved with diversified crops, we'll find that the harvest periods for those crops can fill the remaining 10 months of the storage season, and the resources that are already there will be better used.
Yes, George. Perhaps maybe only one more after George, and we'll have to move to the next group. But there's plenty of scope to bring up your questions then. Yes.
I think the other aspect which I didn't actually hear was that while the losses in terms of quantity, there is also this very big issue which hasn't been monitored all that much, of loss of micronutrients and other issues, vitamin C for example, with length of storage and how it's stored and how it's transported. So the nutritional value, in other words the quality, which isn't just aflatoxins and stuff like that, but just the ordinary things we've been talking about, and that Ruth mentioned as well, and others, of micronutrients. And I think Crops for the Future has done a bit of work on this area. Losses in storage, and I think the Vegetable Centre has too.
I think it wouldn't be difficult, would it, Keith, just to amend the language a little bit to explicitly acknowledge that, and perhaps we can do that before. Thank you. And Excellency.
I think the group did very well on the neglected species. I think yesterday we did acknowledge that perhaps one of the challenges we have is having access maybe to planting either materials or varieties, whatever. I don't know how that one is going to be handled if you have to increase productivity of the same. Did it come out well in the presentation? We acknowledge that I don't know if you got my point, that then on the neglected species, there is a challenge of maybe inaccessibility or unavailability of enough planting either seeds or breeds or materials or whatever. So what can we do with that?
I think we had two activities that spoke to that. One of them was to identify incentives for input suppliers. So that would include seed producers, for example, of seed for neglected crops, and also planting material for things grown vegetatively. So we weren't saying we knew how to do it, we were saying we put a target of identifying those incentives that could then be rolled out. And the other one, the fund we talked about, seed companies, for example, could come to the fund and say, we need some money to help us develop a smallholder farmer network for producing amaranth seed or something along those lines. So I think there were two activities that spoke to that.
And I think possibly it's a perfect lead-in, the knowledge that in fact target 2.5 relates to seed and germplasm availability, and it's probably perfect lead-in, and thank you very much, perhaps to ask someone really specifically looking at that question to come up and present what they did. Can we hold it, Richard, until later? Is it possible? Or is it quick? Okay, shoot.
Yeah, I suppose I'm just a bit overwhelmed by the enormity of the ambition in what we heard in both presentations. And I think what I missed, so I understand the idea about working on guidelines and principles and briefs for policymakers. What I didn't get a sense was identification of, I don't know, what some of us call impact pathways and how you try to influence those impact pathways. One of the challenges that we face is, for example, we're co-located with IFAD. What we would like to see is IFAD to integrate in their programming greater application of agricultural diversity. We think it's an opportunity for them. We have to make the case for investment. We've got Rhoda in the room. Rhoda there sits as a custodian of the compacts, the agricultural and food security compacts. And ambition should be to try and get agricultural diversity into those compacts, because that legitimizes the country level policy framework, the application of resources. So it's trying to identify who are those carriers that you want to influence. I think that didn't come out very clearly, and I think that's the kind of ambition that one should be aiming for. Not just have a fund to finance projects, but actually to influence existing projects and programs. And maybe those incremental projects can be part of that process, but the implementation is not just about having new projects.
Thank you, Richard. I think I'm very comfortable that that's raising it, but do be assured it was discussed, and Keith perhaps make a point of ensuring that that is captured quite explicitly in the literature. Can we move on now, please, to target 2.5? The presenter, Thomas? How did I know it was Thomas?
Forced to present again. Just before we start, a note, because we spent quite a lot of time discussing of what is GAPAD and who owns GAPAD. This target 2.5 is a very specific target. It's about genetic resources. And genetic resources is also a bit of a political sensitive issue. And in our group, there were, I think, 2.5, 3 out of the 5 people were from the CG centers. So in the flyer, it's written, it's spearheaded by Crops for the Future and funded or supported by ILCA. So we thought that the indicators have to be reflecting that, or our activities. But then Max came to our, was our savior and said, no, it's owned by the world. So we need to really find ways of getting buy-in from those other organizations to really make sure that specifically for this target, it's something that we can create ownership. Now, if you read this target, it's 3 things: genetic resources, genetic diversity, and linking to agricultural diversity, which is not specifically mentioned in the target. 2, access and benefit sharing, and 3, traditional knowledge. So we got a couple of activities for each of them. First, the genetic resources. The first activity is capacity building, with a focus specifically on the ex situ, but also in situ maintenance of genetic agricultural biodiversity. This is really technical capacity building on things like collection, storage, generation, documentation for national gene banks and national saviors of agricultural biodiversity, but potentially a focus on neglected and underutilized species, and put it in a positive spin, crops for the future. And a second activity would be related to indicators. Measuring and tracking agricultural biodiversity. And I refer here to Bioversity, the organization Bioversity, who started working on this, and it would be very good to use their experience and expand on this, where we are trying to develop prototype agro-biodiversity index tools to measure biodiversity. And it focuses on the entire spectrum from seed system, production system to consumption systems. And the goal is to come up with a specific list of indicators across that landscape. Currently, it will be tested with private sector in 7 countries. With GAPAD, we can actually leverage this and test it in more countries. I actually, right now on the spot, I hope my group agrees, want to add something that we forgot and that Commissioner Tumusime has mentioned. I think access to seeds specifically for underutilized species should be definitely an activity here. The second part of this indicator, indicator 2.5, the target 2.5, deals with, we have one more, sorry. Very important one. Within genetic and agricultural biodiversity, there's a third activity that we think is very important, that would be very unique for GAPAD, is cost-benefit analysis of genetic and agricultural biodiversity. And the idea is really to cost. What is the benefit of preserving versus the cost of not preserving? And really generate evidence, getting a monetary value on this for investment purposes. We would use existing literature, if existing. We think it only exists maybe for the big crops, definitely not for the underutilized crops. And then use case studies which will guide our prioritization, and then we can share those case studies and even come up with a meta case study. The second big part of this target is benefit sharing and access. So we propose one activity here, which is awareness and capacity building at national level on international treaties on use and benefit sharing. And the goal really is domestication of these treaties and these other international agreements, such as the CDB, into national policies and legal frameworks using a bottom-up approach and strengthening the national partners to give them a voice in the international arena for issues related to benefit and access sharing. The entry point for this would be the Treaty of the FAO. We put a note there for those people that we are not experts. We also realized in our group, for those people that are experts and we've been talking to, this is really a wasp nest. This is a very tricky issue, these treaties related to access and benefit sharing and conventional biological diversity. So we will probably need outside expertise consultants when we write up this particular activity. The last part of this target for the SDG deals with traditional knowledge. So we have two activities that was easier for us to deal with. One would be an international year of neglected and underutilized species, and maybe as a positive spin, crops for the future, not the organization, but the term. And also, a second activity would be establish a knowledge platform for documenting and sharing traditional knowledge, probably using some countries as case studies. We put 2020 for all the activities. It's just an indication. Okay, who will do this? I refer to the comment I made at the beginning, which needs to be something that needs to be taken care of. But we really think that for this particular area, FAO would probably play a key role in convening national partners and be the international platform. With GAPAD play the implementation role, capacity building, and technical role of this particular set of activities. A focus throughout would be mainly, again referring to the first comment I made, mainly underutilized and neglected crops, and probably trying to put the attention also away from the big four that are already taken care of. Risk and mitigation measures, we quickly discussed this. For some of these activities, there will clearly need to be some political will, and we will, of course, use a participatory process, and I think that's it for our group. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Please stay up. Well, thank you very much. Obviously, a target that was addressed by people who are quite knowledgeable in the area, and that was reflected in the professionalism, wasn't it, of the recommendations. Can I ask, please, does anybody have any comments or queries for Thomas on this one? And again, the group, if anybody in the group would like to elaborate on any point or explain further, now's the time to do that. George.
Thank you, Thomas. I think the only point which we perhaps isn't there is it relates to NUS and not the big four or 8 or whatever we want to say. There was a caveat in that, is that we would still not exclude the big 4 or 8, that we would be talking about embedding the NUS, focusing on NUS, but seeing them in some situations as part of, whether it's rice-based, wheat-based, maize-based systems, where the basis is still those crops, but we're seeing the role that NUS can play in diversifying incomes. In some cases, it may be good agronomic practice, and so on. So that is certainly something which investors who still have a mindset of mainstream crops will, I think, sort of bring them on board, that they can see when you get falls in price of the cereal crops and so on, that there's even a monetary value, quite aside from the nutritional value which Ruth and others highlighted yesterday. But I think we need to ensure that it's not sort of them and us in terms of NUS and the rest, because I don't think that's helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that comment, George. Any other? Yes, Ruth.
I want to comment on that traditional knowledge bit. I'm happy to see you are including it, and of course, in this particular case for neglected species, we need traditional knowledge. But many times we don't acknowledge the custodians of the traditional knowledge. We don't celebrate them. You know, in modern science, we have our names appended on articles and so on. We don't do that in the case of traditional knowledge. And so I think we need to add a word like acknowledgement. You can imagine if, say, in a community they are celebrating this. This is the best way to actually promote this species.
Thomas?
Is somebody taking note of these corrections or add-ons, I hope?
Somebody within your group? Secretary, yeah. Any reply? No? Yes, Donna.
The CBD is the first time that benefit sharing came up. And it was followed by the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources of Food and Agriculture, which achieved exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. The international treaty was supposed to allow free exchange of germplasm for scientific purposes. And in fact, because of the benefit sharing idea, it put up a whole bunch of barriers. In reality, where germplasm has not been exploited, there is no benefit to share. And there isn't clear who to share it with. So all I would suggest is that where we're dealing with this particular section, words like pragmatism and what is conceivable must be thought about very hard before any sort of nice words are put together. So let me give you an example. The Indian Plant Varieties Act includes phrases that farmers should be rewarded for the use of their germplasm when it's developed. But when you go into the records for chickpea in Andhra Pradesh, it just says chickpea Andhra Pradesh. Who is going to be the beneficiary? The government of Andhra Pradesh, the 150 million farmers in Andhra Pradesh, or what? The truth of the matter is it's just not practical. And therefore, we need to think about that ahead of time and not create more barriers than that already exist.
Thank you. It's a very good point, Donna. And I think the group did recognise the complexity of this particular. And we'll just take this one and then one more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to follow up about the International Year of Underutilized Crops. I do believe if FAO hears about it, they will jump on the opportunity. So I just wonder, as GAPAD, do we intend to influence so that there is such a day, or do we want to pilot it ourselves? Thank you.
The goal is to influence, to have...
The trade will flow by itself. So in terms of the target, what we have there for investment, you have the description in the work material, and we came up with our key objective of this one, which would be that by 2030, we should double investment in research and development, of course, in the area of agriculture, but trying to reorient it towards the agricultural diversification, research and development requirements, focusing mainly on developing countries. So in terms of how we want to tackle it, the first thing is to review. This is in terms of investment at national level, regional level, and global level. What is the level of investment in research? And this research is in terms of the actual research outputs, but also extension and advisory services, as well as try to see identify what are the gaps and the opportunities from that investment. So the idea is to know by now what's really the level of investment with regards to agricultural diversification. In terms of who should be working on it, we assume that we have spent a lot of energy together here. So GAPAD should play a major role as coordinating it, but working with a series of partners involved in the agricultural research, but as well as agricultural extension services. And we target to have something that review completed by mid next year. In terms of the indicators, we think that if we come up with review papers of that information, we will have a kind of indicators of that, but what we believe that is the major risk is really having all these partners listed here being very committed. Everyone, sometimes people want to protect their niche, so it's just how do we work hard in terms of the risk management to make sure that we can bring this everyone together on board. Then the next one we want to work on is the moment we have seen that we have identified the gap in terms of investment in agricultural diversification, we go ahead and develop strategies to improve the targeted investment so that there is no duplication of efforts. It's well focused and we can achieve more when people work together. So that will be the focus of the strategy. Still the same group of people, and that is by end of 2017. The risk is still the same in terms of indicators is we will generate and circulate the research strategies. Then the other aspect is to try to establish and engage a mechanism that will improve the implementation we will develop, but we need a system to implement the strategies. And to be able to implement those strategies, you need a mechanism and a network to do it. So establishing and engaging the network. So in terms of establishing it, we can say it's something that by even the end of this year, if we work hard, we can get there. But in terms of engaging, we believe that it will be an ongoing process. If we talk about 2030, it's up to almost 2030, we will still have to engage the people with the back and forth, and some people dropping and others getting in. In terms of the indicators, we are referring to establishing, first of all, we have to show that the network is established and develop a monitoring and evaluation framework for the implementation of the strategies related to focusing the investment in agricultural diversification. Then we talked about markets this time. In the market, we have what they would like to achieve within the document we have. And what we develop is to adopt measures that ensure that markets provide incentives for maintaining agricultural diversification, particularly for developing markets and underutilized crops. The key is, as we said yesterday, some people have moved from diversification and focus, for example, on maize and soybean, just because it's market-driven. And as long as we may have the good intention of agricultural diversification, as long as we don't have a way to sustain it, to make sure that we motivate by potential markets for people to generate income, they may be reluctant or kind of setback in some cases. So how do we want to do it? The first thing we would like to do is to do a kind of survey of approaches and methodologies for market development, this time focusing on underutilized crops, and try to see what is happening. Then there will be a self-report. In this case, we believe that there is a group of experts, which includes Crops for Future, ICRAF, and TechnoServe. The target would be like mid-2017. And the next key activities here would be to develop pilot project for market development. We believe that the underutilized crops, the market is not well defined, and there could be several options that could be offered. How do we pilot something which we can say, when we do piloting, it's not really a single commodity like one type of vegetables, but it's everything you bring into your system of agricultural diversification. For each of them, how do you develop market for them? The moment that's done, and we believe it could be done by the GAPAD Secretariat, of course with the network of partners, and here the focus is mainly on international trade companies which have a lot of influential capacity, which could be done by mid-2017. And what we believe could be the indicator is the project reports. From there, we will come up with models that could be used for marketing of this kind of products. And now the next step would be to develop strategies for upscaling the different approaches which would be developed in the pilot. And this includes several aspects to be considered. with the examples of stimulating the demand, stimulating the consumer behavior. How do we change and trigger the interest in it? Traditional vegetables like instead of the exotic ones. How do we improve the post-harvest technology so that we can be able to save some of it so that we minimize the losses, as we were talking about it a few minutes ago by the other groups, and also do a bit of market aggregation if we want to do a bit of exports, for instance. In that one, we are targeting by end of 2018, and the indicators again will be in terms of strategy papers. We discussed a lot. What I'm presenting just a brief, but we have some details in terms of what goes into those strategy papers or other project reports. And finally, what we will do is to also analyze the potential intervention to encourage, to maintain the agricultural diversification. As we said, yes, people can do it, especially when there is initiatives like GAPAD promoting it. But when, let's say, GAPAD pulls out a bit, would the system sustain itself? And then this will require kind of incentives for that to happen. And what we believe is something that could be done by IFPRI in terms of doing, again, like the cost-benefit analysis, but market assessment, trying to identify policies which could, for instance, be conducive to stabilize market prices to prevent the volatility of the prices and so on. This is our target would be by end of 2017. And in terms of the risk, again, is the major one is if we do all these efforts and we do the assessment of the economic analysis and we realize that going for agricultural diversification is not economically attractive, but we know that there may be several agronomic and ecological benefits. How do we promote those ones and be able to deal with the situation? And I do believe that's all in terms of what I have. And mainly is really to see how do we have, as if I can repeat this one, have everyone on board. And we know to have everyone on board, you need to think about resources. Here we are not only talking about cash, but several resources. And now the time to invest in this kind of work. Thank you. Yes, thanks.
You know, it never fails to impress me how much people can achieve in such a short amount of time, and this applies to every single one of the presentations we've seen here this afternoon. An excellent job again, where you know for every one of those recommendations there was a long and complicated discussion that took place, and this is what came out of it. And I warmly congratulate all the groups. Now, with regard to this final one, does anybody have anything they would like to ask or comment on what was presented here today? Yes, please.
Thank you. I was just wondering, when you're looking at what is the current level of investment in R&D, how you're going to distinguish that which is allocated to any particular crop and in particular agricultural diversification by itself, because I think that might be pretty difficult given the data. I mean, ASTI, for example, has a lot of data, and you can separate out bananas and plantains, but then they aggregate other fruits, other vegetables, and those kind of things. So that's one issue. The second aspect of that, if current levels are zero, doubling investment's very easy.
No, it becomes zero.
Yes. So I guess if there's a way to somehow target that level of investment, perhaps you have to find out what the level of investment is first before you actually say double. Otherwise, you kind of need to figure out which level you're aiming at. Anyway, it could be equivalent to historic levels of investment in whatever the major grain is for a particular country, for example.
something along those lines.
Yeah. So what I would say in terms of I would try to be a bit optimistic and assume that the actual investment is not zero. So, but I do believe it's too ambitious in terms of doubling it. But when we try to do the analysis of the current situation at the national, regional, and global level, is especially trying to target cases where we believe that there are instances of diversification. And in our discussion, we said we should be trying to move away from the commodity system and go into the system research rather than commodity research. So we are not targeting a specific crop price. It's just that basket of potential crops that you have in the agricultural diversification system, and then try to see what is the level of investment in that one, and now try to work around it. So in terms of doubling, I do believe what we do in the review process at the national level and regional level and so on is to come up exactly with the baseline of investment by, let's say, in mid next year. Can we have a crude idea of what is the level of investment in the area of agricultural diversification? And we can easily be able to tell that, you know what, no one is investing seriously into it. Then you need to do the education exercise to promote it. So for the group members, anything you would like to add on this one?
Thanks. We didn't put ASTI up there, but it's clearly critical. I mean, it's the best source of information on this, and as you say, they do include some disaggregation by crop, but it's difficult. The doubling we referred to was total investment in agricultural R&D, not doubling on diversification research, and that was based on the ASTI data. In fact, if you look at Africa as a whole, I think it's about 0.54 the percent of AG agricultural GDP. The target is 1%. In Africa, we're about 0.54. So we're saying to achieve the targets already set, we need to roughly double. So that was the origin of that. Just on a separate issue, on target 2B, we chose to drop because it's very specific. It talks about this issue of removing export subsidies, and we didn't see there was an immediate direct link to agricultural diversification there, added to which it's already been addressed to some extent. We shall see how effectively in the future by the Nairobi Ministerial last December of the WTO. So we thought maybe there's not a lot of mileage in us thinking about that. Although trade is clearly an important area, that particular target was very specific.
Can I the hypothesis was that in terms of spending on agricultural R&D is that the current sort of structure of agricultural R&D tends to reinforce the monoculture approach. And succeeding hypothesis is that research directly on agriculture diversification tends to be fragmented, if it exists at all. So the intent then is to suggest that in order to move agriculture R&D towards a focus on agricultural intensification or agricultural diversification, that you're going to require additional resources to do that and changes in program structures in order to do that, which are supported in turn by the additional resources.
Maybe have the microphone to Dino, please.
Size for things that should be done. But I have a considerable concern over the dates that were put down. If I was to go to Schengen Fan tomorrow and say, here is $20 million, you have to do all of those things, he wouldn't make any of those deadlines. So by putting deadlines which essentially can't be achieved, it rather then calls into question whether the actual targets are sensible. I would much rather you were conservative about the timing and perhaps add 1 or 2 years to each of those things, then it becomes, in my opinion, much more realistic.
Thank you, Dono. And following on with that, of course, and I'll make the observation, this is something that is potentially not a criticism, but a factor to consider with Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 itself, in as much as some of the target dates put in there, there would be fairly universal consensus that some of them just can't be achieved. They never could be achieved, and one is left then asking what was the reason for writing that date and what is the outcome of that. Well, yes, that's right. But I would suggest, however, that's right, and that poses in itself a challenge, because on the one hand, you've raised an incredibly important and relevant point, and on the other, it's necessary to be cognizant of what the SDA 2030 has said they want to happen, and if you come out with dates that are clearly well beyond that, and I'm not suggesting a year or two would get us anywhere near there, but you would in essence be saying we are not going to implement SDA 2030, and that in itself can create problems. So I hope we are not in the position of self-delusional game playing, and I think that's the point. You have a very, very good point, and it's one I think is going to test and vex those who are putting the final GAPAD document together on a few occasions and in a few areas. But the principle you've raised is a very important one, I think, and I'm sure the team would be happy to sort of reflect
Not taken.
Yes. Do we have any more? Yes.
Mine is just a comment for you maybe to note and see how you are going to handle the likely conflict. It's a comment related to the monoculture approach vis-a-vis the African policy now regarding the slow pace of industrialization on the continent, arising out of the fact that there has been a kind of stagnation as far as industrialization is concerned. The governments now, and also supported by financial institutions, especially with maybe the current resources African Development Bank is putting on the table, the emphasis is going to be on commodity orientation. And looking at the farm level, you note that the farms have been diversified because the small-scale farms are really diversified. But of course, for research, that is quite different. Now, just for you to note, the two are not in harmony with regard to the orientation of the continent as far as policy is concerned. Now also on the gap upon what could be done as far as research is concerned. I don't know if you have got my point. You've got it? I want to be sure.
Yeah, I would say, but I have probably to check if I understand it correctly, because here what we discuss is to promote agricultural diversification. There is the assumption that at farm levels, maybe it's already there, but in the scope of the target for industrialization, you may just see that I want to focus, for example, on these crops, and you invest more energy on those crops, which may be not probably going the same line, matches exactly the idea of diversification, because probably there is a crop you want to promote the most based on the target for industrialization. I don't know if that is the point or if it's
the available resources now, which governments are trying to put on table, is to focus on specific commodities so that those commodities are developed right from research to the table through the value chain. But just lining up a commodity, one or two, and then not necessarily having kind of a diversified approach.
Yeah, for that one, if I go back to what I was saying yesterday, if we...
Yes, Max, I just wanted to follow on to that and then have my own comment in that you could still develop the maize I don't like for industrial use because we're not even producing enough. So we could produce a lot of it, even cassava, potatoes, starches for industrial use, not necessarily for diets. Now, the point I then want to make is that healthy diets are very expensive. It is those of us who can afford that can afford eat healthy. The poor eat the nice tasting, easily available, terrible foods, you know? So if we are going to change all that, there has to be some incentive to produce enough so that the affordability is possible for most people. And the other issue is that as we produce these same foods, where is the private sector? In your presentation, I didn't see the private sector. I only saw international companies for trade, but clearly the private sector needs to have a role to play in here, and how do we convince them to come on board? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of the aspects that I said, if you see in the areas, in terms of the risks, we have identified. One was these stakeholders, and I do agree with you, the private sector, for instance, how do you bring them on board? So in our risk management plan, probably something we have to be more elaborated on that aspect. But again, I do believe if we can come up with this market, which is also a challenge, opportunities, there is likelihood that you get the private sector on board, but it has something that represents a risk, like the industrialization versus agricultural diversification. Then in terms of the diet, the healthy diet, I do agree with you, but I tend also to make a bit of nuance here. Because if you try to look at it, and you may disagree or agree with me, but we all have some cases to show. I believe even those with good income, maybe the first one not really going for healthy diet. If you just go to those probably with in some cases, limited resources, the only thing is they don't have enough spaces for the diversification. But when they have the spaces, they can do better. And I can use my own example. When I was a small boy, I do believe we were very few in the family, and the land was still big. And you know how we share the land in our African systems to make sure that those who have not been able to continue studies get pieces of land. It becomes small. While we used to have almost 17, 20 type of crops on that land, today is almost maize, not maize. Maize is not even there. I come from an area where it's mainly cassava, then in common bean, and they stop there because there is no more land. And people will just rely on that. That's why it's really a problem. But if they were to have access to that food, majority of them, yes, it will not be as much health as the science tells us, but if they have access to that food, I do believe they can try to diversify. It's even ourselves, including myself, who have to be educated in terms of focusing on healthy diets and probably spend money on the traditional vegetables rather than going to those exotic ones sometimes.
Thank you. We have another question over there, John?
To contribute, probably, yeah.
Just to reinforce the point over here, investment strategies by principal donors in the agricultural sector, particularly here in sub-Saharan Africa, such as the African Development Bank, such as the Gates Foundation, and to a significant extent USAID, do focus primarily on commodities, and both on the research side as well as on the downstream development side. And that does reinforce approaches to monoculture. But the challenge for GAPAD is how to think about an investment template that supports agricultural diversification. We don't have that yet, but yet it could feed into, for example, the country investment plans or investment plans by the African Development Bank. So a lot of work to be done there, but it's absolutely essential in order to shift sort of investment streams as they're currently structured.
Thank you. And of course, that comment helps to highlight the integrated nature of what we're doing here today, because with the team that looked at targets 2.3 and 2.4, one of their recommendations was to develop an agricultural index, global agricultural index, that would have quantifiable scales for sustainability, for nutrient production, for agricultural biological diversity. And these would enable investment decisions not simply to be called to account by profitability or by yield, but they can be stipulated such that we will only invest in those projects that will satisfy agricultural biodiversity scale of 4 or above. So you come to us with a proposal that's going to create a monoculture desert with an agricultural rating of 2, we're not going to fund it, because it is our policy that we are a responsible funder. Therefore, we are going to have an ability to actually articulate with metrics into treaties, into government policies, into investment decisions, on scales for sustainability, for nutrient production, for biodiversity, and that these can drive investment decisions and hopefully begin to influence and in a positive way the very problem that you've mentioned. But it just does highlight that what we're doing is very much integrated, isn't it? So thank you. Before we go into Daniel, we'll head over here, please.
I wanted to make also a small comment. When you were talking about developing markets, etc., I was really thinking we need much more work on the consumer side. And it has been said a bit all over the place, also now, but also with the first group. We really do not know enough what people actually eat and why they eat so, etc. We need much more knowledge to understand all these issues. There's things that Ruud was mentioning, healthy diets are too expensive. There's so many things inside there that we don't understand yet. And then I wanted to, you need to develop this consumer side to actually be able to develop your markets and to create demand for these diversified foods and these diversified products. And I wanted to bring it also back to one of the very first comments that was made, I think from that side. It's John, sorry if I missed the name. Is it agricultural biodiversity contributing to diets and nutrition, or is it the other way around? I think it can be working on both sides. Because if people are very aware about what a good diet is, and I think there's really opportunities here because people are more and more aware about health issues and other stuff, it can be, and there will be a higher demand for nutritious foods, etc. It can also be like the pull factor to diversify our farms, not only pushing the diversified farms to contribute to nutrition, but also nutrition to pull the diversification of the farms.
Yeah, I do believe I can't agree more than with you in terms of
long-term sort of plan. It would just be as much as saying we have no intention of endeavouring to achieve SDA 2030, and it will go nowhere. And the groups were mindful of that, and nobody did that. The groups came back with recommendations that were clearly related to SDA 2030 targets, demonstrably related, relevant. The things that have been brought forward, I was very pleased to see were specific, they were measurable, thought was given and discussion was pulled out whether they were achievable. We pointed out who was responsible in some groups didn't get quite to that level, but never mind, they've given enough that can be done, and they were time bound. I think every group considered the deliverable time frame. So in that sense, Personally, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the breadth, with the technical content and the knowledge of what came out of the groups. I think, having talked to people who were in the groups, everybody was satisfied with the process of their group. They felt they had a chance to say what they wanted to say. It was listened to. I was very pleased to hear that. And the outcome was very helpful and will greatly assist, and this is the whole point, isn't it, will greatly assist those who ultimately must pull all of these together into a cohesive action plan called GAPAD. And what you have contributed will help to make that task possible. Without your contribution over these 2 days, I don't think it would actually be very easily possible for any group I can think of to take Sustainable Agenda 2030 and distill it to GAPAD without this critical guidance and advice that you are giving as specialists. We are deeply honoured that you've given up your time, each and every one of you. Is a valuable contributor, and to have your input is invaluable. So for that, I thank everybody who has worked on this. Those who are the secretaries, from the Q&A, you've had comments, you've had questions, you may have taken the opportunity to tweak and fine-tune your original documentation. Can you please ensure that the final version that you and your group are comfortable with can be made available? And I think, Keith, are you the repository for all of these? Keith? As the rapporteur for the conference, you are the one who should receive the refined version, please. So can I ask each of the secretaries to please don't go home without ensuring that the final version goes to the conference rapporteur. For those who were the presenters, the press would like to talk with you and interview you, so can you please make yourself available to them. Hands up those who are from the press. So, at the back, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so they're the guys, please look for them. They'd like to talk to you and interview you, please. For the remainder, please let's go out, stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee. When we come back, we're changing the program a little because I didn't want to cut short the Q&A session for the presentations. When we come back, we'll have an hour, and the format for that, I will actually exit the podium and I'm going to hand this over to Syed. And Syed will give you a presentation, a short presentation on the way forward and the process, and then it will be, and I'm sure it will be a sufficiently interactive period over that 1 hour so that we can have your collective thoughts. I did want to just explain that there was a query with the group working on Target 2.5. And we talked about it, and I gave them an explanation that I haven't given to everybody else about what happens with GAPAD. Like, how does GAPAD become an instrument? Now, Syed will tease this out, an instrument of influence. Syed will tease this out, but in essence, what you have created will feed into a process that will involve people of sufficient I use the word gravitas, reputation, expertise and experience, people who are unquestionable credibility and their supporting staffs. And they will, through a process that is yet to be determined, but I envisage will involve a number of meetings, probably in different geographies, they will distill your inputs from each of the roundtables into a cohesive and integrated document that will be GAPAD. Now, we may have a phased approach of this because there's a lot, isn't there? There's a lot.
Do you think you're ready?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Let's start.
Okay, so one of the Sustainable Development Goals 2 targets is to increase the use of genetic and biodiversity, and also access and benefit sharing, and thirdly, increase indigenous knowledge and use of indigenous knowledge. Now, when you talk about genetic and agrobiodiversity, it's in a dire state right now in the world. So the FAO recommends, sorry, let me start. You're going to cut, huh?
Yes.
So the FAO estimates that worldwide there's about 1,500 gene banks where seeds that we use now, but especially that we're going to use in the future, seed banks in the world. And many of these seed banks are deteriorating because of lack of funding, but also because of war, because of disasters, flooding, drought, volcanoes, name it, in the world. So that genetic diversity is dwindling very quickly. So we have to do something in the world to make sure that we keep that genetic diversity for future generations. Now, another thing additional to this is that many of those seed banks in the world focus on the big crops, maize, rice, wheat, and very few of them have collections of what we use to call underutilized species. Things like vegetables, bambara groundnut, moringa, amaranth. So they are really in a very dire strait of preservation. So what we try to do with this GAPAD initiative is to make sure that we incentivize policymakers, governments, to make sure that genetic diversity is not only lost but also kept and even increased. That's one thing. The second part deals with access and benefit sharing. For example, I'm here in Kenya. If in Kenya people find a very good amaranth variety which has amazing potential, say in Nigeria, yeah, there needs to be things in place that countries can share that genetic material, while making sure that whoever owns that genetic material gets money or any other benefits back for sharing. And this is not an easy thing to do. So we also have to, with GAPAD, make sure that benefits sharing and access of this genetic material, especially the unutilized crops and species, that this is harmonized, specifically focusing on the farmers and the national systems. And third deals with traditional knowledge. There's a lot of traditional knowledge out there, and with the big commodities, people now all eat rice, wheat, maize, even in the cities. With the big commodities making a lot of progress, we have to make sure that this traditional knowledge, again, underutilized species such as vegetables that you used to grow and eat when you were a child, make sure that these traditional vegetables, fruits and other crops, that knowledge about these traditional crops is not lost for future generations. We have to really make sure that we capture that information.
Do you encourage individuals to have their own seed banks?
It's many farmers, if you go to the rural areas, they will have their own seed banks. They have seeds that are that you can store, that you can keep. They're not hybrid seeds made by big companies, and many of those seeds are actually traditional and indigenous crops. And also, many of the big companies are not interested in those traditional and underutilized crops. So yes, many farmers actually do have their own seed banks. We don't call them seed banks, but they have. But with agriculture moving on and becoming more intensive, there is a big risk that these farmer-owned seed banks are getting lost. So it's something that we have to focus on a lot to make sure that the seeds and the knowledge pertaining to those seeds and this huge variety is not lost forever.
With these seed banks in place, and with this campaign, are we not running into a risk where, in order to scale up, we will start hybridizing these seeds, the traditional seeds, and in the long run end up losing the seeds that farmers used to plant in different generations?
That's not a good question. No, Well, first of all, when people say conserving seeds, it's the purpose really is to conserve all the wild land races, the wild types. For example, people eat rice. You only eat a couple of varieties that are commercialized, but there's a lot of wild rice varieties out there that have been bred or even are in the wild for tens of thousands of years, which contain information or variable traits to combat pests, diseases, drought, flooding, things that are coming our way because of climate change. So by conserving those things, those seeds, breeders and other organizations, private companies can use those seeds to go back to the source material and find traits in that wild material to put it in new varieties. But also, when you say conservation of seeds, as I mentioned, don't only think of some building somewhere where there's a lot of seeds stored. Farmers themselves conserve as well, and we call this in situ conservation, where you basically conserve varieties in your field. So when you go to any farmer's field, you will see that they have a lot of different varieties. They know that by having agrobiodiversity, by having different varieties of, for example, maize or beans in one plot, you actually make sure that you have a set of different materials that is coping very well with pests, diseases, drought, etc.
It's easy to chew.
Yeah, that's better. Okay, that's fine. You can proceed. Yeah, so you give us your name and then you explain what your group was all about.
Good.
And the resolutions that came from that group and how we are going to factor it into this GAPAD thing.
Good, sure. So, you will tell me when it's almost time to start? Yes, I can. Good. My name is Kageri Maiso. I work for the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, and we are involved in this GAPAD network. The working group was working group number 4, which was focusing on the markets, trades, and investment. And when we were working on it, we realized that the most critical ones is investment and then markets. In terms of investments, we believe that a lot has been done in terms of agricultural research, but where we have a challenge is how much of it goes into agricultural diversification. So what we are recommending is to double the budget for agricultural research, but significantly increase the share that goes to agricultural diversification. So what is going to be done is mainly to work on assessment of how much is being invested in agricultural area, and then how can we double it with the particular focus on agricultural diversification. Then agricultural diversification is very interesting in terms of principles, but in terms of the practice, it's not always that easy. Because as one of the participants mentioned it, there is a trend to improve industrialization in the African system, and we know that is mainly focused on commodities. Let's say one promoting soybean, one promoting maize, and so on. How do we make this compatible with agricultural diversification? We believe that through markets development, especially for underutilized crops, and going beyond the 4 major crops we have heard about, which are mainly wheat, maize, I can say about soybean and so on, how do we increase these crops and create markets to what you bring into your agricultural system? The moment we can improve the markets of the additional crops, certainly that there is going to be a lot of investment in it, and we believe that even governments or international development agents will be able to invest into it. And the reason we didn't spend a lot of time talking about trade is the moment you have markets and people can make money from it, people will probably invest in trading those commodities. So what is really important in this case is how to bring in different stakeholders, the different varieties of stakeholders, which will include policymakers, private sector, which was a critical point that was made during our discussion, that we need to make sure that the private sector is behind it. and make sure that in terms of what we spend, we improve diversification. Diversification is critical not only for diets, but it's also for income generation. So one of the key things is to come up with platforms, investigating what is the situation, current situation, and the pathways to improve it. And we do believe that GAPAD is a good network, which includes a variety of stakeholders who will make things happen. That's what I can say about what we discussed. I don't know whether there is an area where you would like to get more clarification.
Yeah, I would want to find, when you say creating markets for new crops, what kind of promotion are we talking about here? Because people will tend to stick on what they know much than what they don't know. Cutting them from this and telling them, yes, you can supplement it with this. What kind of promotion do you think?
Yeah, that's an excellent comment, because we have been criticized by the communities, and ourselves we have also done a bit of autocritic, and we realize that most of our research in terms of this area ends up in our working stations. There is a lot of need in terms of the awareness creation, trying to educate and try to generate evidence. There is a potential market and potential benefits of some of unutilized crops in terms of health benefits, in terms of diet benefits. But because there is not significant training or capacity building education, some people will say, we have been to school, we have been educated. But it's not questioning that aspect, but it's just making sure that we create the awareness for people to understand that this is what I'm eating and this is what I'm getting benefits from it. We know, like in our discussion, we indicated that some of the type of diabetes could be controlled by healthy diets. And some of these vegetables, which are potential good to control diabetes, are the ones that we have stopped eating. And if we can build the capacity and the awareness and education of the people, then we create market for it. So by educating people, you create the market, you increase the demand, which will drive almost the trading of all of it. So it's really a matter of educating people to understand what they can benefit by changing the behavior and the choices of food.
Okay, now that you are a research scientist, I want to put this to you again. By this campaign, it means that there will be tendencies of scaling up growing of unutilized crops, which will run us into, I'm just trying to imagine, into hybridization of the same. And you know, these crops are drought resistant, they have been there for years, and people have been using them. Are we not going to run into a danger of losing these crops because of hybridization?
Not necessary, because one of the many things we do, yes, we improve in terms of the genetic potential of these crops, but at the same time we have the genetic banks so that we can keep most of the traits of these vegetables. So what we are trying to do is not just to replace by breeding new varieties, but to make sure that we keep the gene bank of these varieties. And as we talk about potential climate change will affect the type of crops. So what we produce today is not necessarily what we are going to produce tomorrow to be able to mitigate the climate change. But that information has to be kept for future generations. If we come up with good adaptation measures and mitigation measures of the climate change or other things, to make sure that we keep that information for future research. So the key is, let us keep, even if we don't produce today, let us keep the material to be able to produce when the conditions are conducive enough.
That should be sufficient for the group.
Oh, okay.
There, yes. Yes. Look at this girl. This is where we are.
Okay.
This one does not know you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, start with your name, then about your group, and the overview of it. You are talking about the overview, then she'll talk about the resolutions.
Yes.
Okay. We are good to go.
All right. My name is Esther Omosa. I'm a nutrition specialist working with the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, at Nairobi campus. Our group looked at the target 2, 2.1 and 2.2, looking at access to nutritious, safe, and safe foods. Sorry, can we start again? Sorry.
It's okay, it's okay.
We were looking at, okay, we'll cut, yeah? We were looking at access. One was to end hunger and improve access to nutritious and safe foods for all groups, especially the infants and women of reproductive age and adolescent girls. And why this was important is because of their state or their importance, because we understand that malnutrition is a vicious cycle which starts from right before conception. If the mother conceives and she's not of optimal nutrition status, then this affects the baby, and studies have shown that stunting starts intrauterine, so the baby is affected. This leads to low birth weight and other complications. So why nutrition is important? There has been focus to look at the first 1,000 days, that is from conception to when the child is 2 years. That is when they need to be fed well, so that it prevents the malnutrition. And later in life, after the baby is 5 years and above, there is the adolescent stage, where we know there are certain micronutrients that are important, especially for the girl. Issues like anemia affect the girls of reproductive, women of reproductive age, and so that's why we focus on that. And of course, lactating women, we know that it's important to breastfeed the baby for the first 6 months of life. It increases the chances of good health and optimal nutrition, and feed the babies appropriately at 6 months and above, up to 2 years. So that's the focus.
Okay, so the underutilized food crops, how are they coming in? How important are they? Does it mean that what we utilize does not give us proper nutrition value?
Over the years, we've reduced the diversity or the range from where we take our foods from. Foods have become more monotonous and repetitive, looking at very minimal food groups. And we understand that internationally we have wheat, rice, maize, that is commonly consumed. But what we are saying is that underutilized foods or crops also have opportunities to improve dietary diversity. And also this includes livestock, and that includes animal source foods and eggs and milk and the like. So it is important that the diets are diversified, so that we meet the micronutrient levels that are needed for optimal nutrition.
Can you mention some of the animal-based diets that are underutilized?
Because of cost, we understand that animal source foods can be expensive, and therefore evidence has shown that families or households that are low in income do not consume as many animal source foods as they should, whereas we've seen a rise in consumption of animal source foods among households that have a high economic status.
How easy or difficult is it to convince some communities to begin partaking of foods such as insects?
Insects are known to be nutritious. Actually, some of the insects have proved to have high contents of protein. Therefore, it's a good option. However, there are cultural issues around consumption of insects. But we've seen in some parts of Kenya, for example, and other countries like in Asia, Thailand, for example, they consume a lot of the insects, and it's culturally acceptable, and it's part of their diet systems, their food systems. So for the new communities that have not consumed these foods, it may take a bit of more education, especially educating them on the nutritional benefits, and most importantly on how to prepare these foods, the insects, and to make them palatable and interesting to eat.
That should be it.
Oh yeah.
And the palm larvae. Very good.
Somebody describes them as being nutty and crunchy.
This crunchy, it's like.
Yeah. Okay, you'll be talking about the resolutions of the group.
Yes.
Start with your name.
Okay.
Then what the group decided should be done.
Yeah. Okay. So, my name is Céline Termote. I'm working for Biodiversity International, and I'm doing research into the links between farm diversity and dietary diversity for good nutrition. So as a resolution, we were to discuss about how agricultural biodiversity should contribute to good diets and ultimately nutrition. So the resolutions we found, maybe first I want to make a remark. The nutrition indicators are really set at a quite high level. So if you want to work with agricultural biodiversity, produce more diversified foods, more species, more varieties and so on, we will be able to directly, hopefully, mediating some nutrition education and training to influence the diets of the people. That's one thing that we can do as agronomists working towards nutrition. Now to go from healthy diets to good nutrition indicator outcomes like stunting, wasting, etc., there's other things that are needed. There's you need good health, you need good care for the small children and so on. So, but we definitely know that without good diets you cannot reach nutrition. So it's a necessary factor, but it's not. There's much more that is needed to obtain. So that's why we primarily want to look at the links between agricultural diversity and dietary diversity. So one of the resolutions that we set is like we need to disentangle a little bit those indicators that in the Sustainable Development Goals have been set quite high. And if you want to really prove with our actions that we are able to change things, we need some intermediate outcome indicators so that we can say, like, look, this is actually what we can achieve, but then if we have the collaboration of people in the health sector, education sector, etc., we will then ultimately have impact on those stunting indicators and so on. So that was the first resolution. The second one is that we need to provide more evidence on how agricultural biodiversity contributes actually to dietary diversity in our case. We need to disentangle those impact pathways. They are not very well understood. What needs to happen? It's more than just putting different crops in my field. People need to be educated on how to combine them towards a good diet, how to prepare them, how to conserve them, how to stock them, and so on. So there's a lot of things still to be figured out. Also the women empowerment that really plays, how much access do women have to nutritious foods, how much say do they have within the household about which foods to consume, prepare, and so on. So evidence needs to be created, and therefore we need to do basically two main things. There's very little information that we know today about food composition. A lot of these underutilized crops have never been analyzed in the labs. So we have still a lot of gaps there to know exactly what is the nutrient content of these underutilized species, etc. So a lot of work to be done there. Luckily there is FAO working on that. They work with the different countries to elaborate countrywide food composition tables, but I think as GAPAD we need to really lobby for that work, make that work known, try to gather together the necessary resources for FAO and the countries to be able to continue that piece of work. The other piece of work that is needed is then look at what do people eat and why do they eat that. The food consumption studies that do integrate also information on agricultural biodiversity. Why do we need that? Because we need to understand why people eat what they eat. We need to understand what they actually eat. There's very few studies. We actually do not know what people are eating. So if we understand that better, there will be a way also how to look at how can we now make use of all this diversity in there to improve those diets of the people. So that was the second resolution, was creating a much broader and better evidence base for agricultural biodiversity to contribute to healthy diets and nutrition. The third strategy was we need to foster multi-sectoral platforms where people can come together. You know, until today, agronomists know that nutrition is important. Nutritionists today know that agriculture is the first source of foods and thus nutrients. It's already a big step. 10 years ago was not like that. But now we need to find the ways also of having these people working together and to see how can we mainstream agricultural biodiversity in nutrition strategy papers, but also in agricultural strategy papers and so on. So fostering multi-sectoral platforms, bringing people together, and then also mainstream agricultural biodiversity and nutrition is the third point that we discussed. Then there's two other things that are a bit cross-cutting, not only regarding nutrition, but they are important, I think, a bit everywhere. But they are particularly important in nutrition because women are the primary caretakers. They are the ones preparing the meals. They are the ones having the knowledge, feeding, if you want, the families, with the support of the husbands, of course. But so we need to work on gender issues and women empowerment. Do they know enough about healthy days, how to prepare them, how to stock them? We need to empower them because we also know that income, if women generate income, that it benefits much more towards the health and the diets of the family members. And there's an additional reason why we look and we have to empower women is that if you look at the intergenerational cycles, women are the ones that are giving birth to our children, boys as well as girls. So if the women are malnourished, you get a child that is already born stunted or malnourished. So there's an additional reason why we really should look at the women and then also the small children because they are very, very vulnerable. And the last point we really discussed was also like youth empowerment. What we see nowadays is that the youth, they are all going to the cities, the towns, because there's better infrastructure there and so on. So we need to really think about how can we get the youth back into agriculture and how can agricultural diversification help to get the youth back into agriculture. A major point there is also why do these young people flee to the cities is the infrastructure. So how can we bring better infrastructure also to the villages, etc., so that they can fully develop themselves in the villages, find a way how to generate income to support their families, etc. So I think these are the main resolutions that we have discussed in our group.
I'm just wondering, agriculture diversification and biofortification of the existing diets, which one is easier to do?
The most easy...
Instead of starting to look for new crops that we are not utilizing, why don't we biofortify what we have and we are good to go?
Okay, there's two things there. The first thing is there are a lot of crops that are there. You only have to go, for example, where we are working in Vihiga. There's plenty of indigenous vegetables there. People know them, but people tend to neglect. Why? Because nowadays the focus is on maize, is on sukuma wiki and whatever. So this, it's not, we do not want to bring new crops really to the people, but we want to look at what diversity is there already in the community and how can we promote that one to increase, to improve the diets. And at some point you might say, especially in very dry areas or at certain periods of the year where it is more difficult, etc., you might say, okay, it becomes very hard to use what we have, only to use what we have, so maybe we need additional strategies, and that's where I think fortification and the other strategies do come in, and they have also their importance. But let's first look, don't think about, oh, let's import from here or there, let's look what is there in the community, how far can we get in reaching adequate diets, and then we can say, okay, there's still a gap here or here, so maybe this additional strategy needs to come in the community.
Okay, begin with your name and then by explaining, introducing the group, what you discussed about, and then we get into the details, please.
And then get, sorry? And
Start
then
with your name.
Yeah.
Then
and what we discussed
tell us
about
what the group
yeah.
was all about, the targets
Yeah.
of the group,
Yeah.
and then you'll give us the overview of what you discussed.
Okay.
Yeah. Rolling.
Okay. My name is Max Harriman. As a member of the Sustainable Roundtable discussion for GAPAD on the goals for the Sustainable Development Agenda of 2.3 and 2.4. And the 2.3 goal concerns the doubling of productivity and doubling of smallholder incomes by 2030. And then the target 2.4 concerns establishing sustainable agricultural production systems and resilient agriculture, or again by 2030. Now, to understand these two targets, we need to understand the threats that they're trying to counter. So when we're talking about resilient agricultural systems and sustainable production systems, we're talking about this in the context of global climate change. And the existing agricultural system is extremely vulnerable. It's vulnerable because so few crops and grown in so few locations, and these locations going forward into the future are going to have difficulty producing these very few major crops. So we needed to deliberate on how we could make agricultural systems more resilient. What would we need to do? The group came up with a number of initiatives, too many to summarize in detail at this point, but amongst them, some of the major initiatives included creating a global agricultural knowledge base. Now, the essence of this is that most of the data we have in the world at the moment relates to very few crops. We know a lot about wheat, rice, maize and soybean. But as we move away from those handful of crops out into the lesser known and underutilized crops, our knowledge of these crops is much, much less. So what we have decided to do, and we've resolved to do here, is to develop an agricultural knowledge base that will have the same depth of knowledge of these lesser used crops, because without that knowledge, investment decisions cannot be made to use these as ingredients. Major companies cannot take the risk of using crops that they don't have that knowledge about. So the global agricultural knowledge base will be an enabling tool that will facilitate these underutilized crops being able to be brought in and used in place of the 4 or up to 6 or 7 major crops. The advantage of this, of course, is that we change our approach. Instead of looking at a place and saying, how do I change that place to grow one of these 4 crops? Either we add water, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, so that we can grow these 4 or 5 crops. We change it and we look at the landscape and say, what crop grows here? What crop can grow here? And by doing that, and by using these underutilized crops, we can improve the resilience of agriculture. The other initiative we came up with today was to develop a global agricultural index. At present, the decisions made on whether a crop is grown
are influenced primarily by profit, by financial considerations. What is the internal rate of return for my investment in this particular agribusiness? What we don't, and often that translates into assessments of yield. What we don't consider is what impact will that have on sustainability? How sustainable is this? What does it do to biological diversity? And importantly, what will be the nutritional production from this initiative? So at present we can grow a crop as a vast monoculture in which there's very little biodiversity. It produces potentially very low levels of nutrition, especially micronutrients, but it's high yield and it delivers a return, and that's the only consideration. The Global Agricultural Index that we resolved to develop today will give a measurable figure for biodiversity, for sustainability and for nutrient production, such that investment decisions can be required to satisfy. For example, we will not invest, although it's profitable, we will not invest in a business that scores less than, for argument's sake, less than 4 out of 10 on the biodiversity index. Paris Climate Change Agreement agreed to commitments, again by almost the same countries, to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions to keep the global temperature below 2 degrees above the current or the pre-industrial revolution levels. And what we realized in Paris, and of course through the experience we have of the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda, was agriculture, and particularly agricultural diversification, must play a part in reducing our carbon emissions and particularly meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance poverty. So we proposed an action plan which we called GAPAD, the Global Action Plan for Agricultural Diversification, to address 6 of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So for instance, if I give you an example, energy. How would we diversify agriculture to address the issue of energy? Another one would be life on land. How would we diversify our use of land to address Sustainable Development Goals? So there are 6 goals. This meeting here in Nairobi is to address Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is actually to end hunger and provide nutrition. And that's been the purpose of the meetings that we've been here for yesterday and today, the Roundtable Forum. Now to achieve that, we need to bring together the best minds, the best researchers, the best stakeholders that we can to address the issue of SDG 2, nutrition, and how that will actually achieve the goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030. So we have GAPAD, we have all those goals, and this particular meeting was about SDG 2, nutrition. And what I've been really impressed with and delighted with is the degree of commitment and enthusiasm amongst our colleagues in Nairobi to actually set out a plan of how we're going to address the targets. The target is very challenging. You know, how do we achieve those targets by 2030, which of course is only 14 years away, that we're going to achieve all of these very, very ambitious goals the world has signed up to. And in this particular case, we've been looking at how nutrition can be addressed by diversifying agriculture beyond the major crops that we currently depend on. Of course, we know these major...
We need to provide more evidence on how agricultural biodiversity contributes actually to dietary diversity in our case. We need to disentangle those impact pathways. They are not very well understood. What needs to happen? It's more than just putting different crops in my field. People need to be educated on how to combine them towards a good diet, how to prepare them, how to conserve them, how to stock them, and so on. So there's a lot of things still to be figured out. Also the women empowerment that really plays, how much access do women have to nutritious foods, how much say do they have within the household about which foods to consume, prepare. And
in terms of investments, we believe that a lot has been done in terms of agricultural research, but where we have a challenge is how much of it goes into agricultural diversification. So what we are recommending is to double the budget for agricultural research, but significantly increase the share that goes to agricultural diversification. So what is going to be done is mainly to work on assessment
of how much is being invested in agricultural area, and then how can we double it with the particular focus on agricultural diversification. Then agricultural diversification is very interesting in terms of principles, but in terms of the practice, it's not always that easy. There is a trend to improve industrialization in the African system, and we know that is mainly focused on commodities. Let's say one promoting soybean, one promoting maize, and so on. How do we make this compatible with agricultural diversification? We believe that through markets development, especially for underutilized crops, and going beyond the 4 major crops we have heard about, which are mainly wheat, maize, I can say about soybean and so on, how do we increase these crops and create markets to what you bring into your agricultural system? The moment we can improve the markets of the additional crops, certainly that there is going to be a lot of investment in it, and we believe that even governments or international development agents will be able to invest into it.
Over the years, we've reduced the diversity or the range from where we take our foods from. Foods have become more monotonous and repetitive, looking at very minimal food groups. And we understand that internationally we have wheat, rice, maize, that is commonly consumed. But what we are saying is that underutilized foods or crops also have opportunities to improve dietary diversity. And also this includes livestock, and that includes animal source foods and eggs and milk and the like. So it is important that the diets are diversified so that we meet the micronutrient levels that are needed for optimal nutrition.
So one of the Sustainable Development Goals 2 targets is to increase the use of genetic and biodiversity, and also access and benefit sharing, and thirdly, increase indigenous knowledge and use of indigenous knowledge. Yes. So the FAO estimates that worldwide there's about 1,500 gene banks where seeds that we use now, but especially that we're going to use in the future, seed banks in the world. And many of these seed banks are deteriorating because of lack of funding, but also because of war, because of disasters, flooding, drought, volcanoes, name it, in the world. So that genetic diversity is dwindling very quickly. So we have to do something in the world to make sure that we keep that genetic diversity for future generations. Now, another thing additional to this is that many of those seed banks in the world focus on the big crops, maize, rice, wheat, and very few of them have collections of what we use to call underutilized species, things like vegetables, bambara groundnut, moringa, amaranth. So they are really in a very dire strait of preservation. So what we try to do with this GAPAD initiative is to make sure that we incentivize policymakers, governments, to make sure that genetic diversity is not only lost but also kept and even increased.
Long-term sort of plan, it would be as much as saying we have no intention of endeavouring to achieve SDA 2030, and it will go nowhere. And the groups were mindful of that, and nobody did that. The groups came back with recommendations that were clearly related to SDA 2030 targets, demonstrably related, relevant. The things that have been brought forward, I was very pleased to see, were specific, they were measurable, thought was given and discussion was pulled out whether they were achievable. We pointed out who was responsible in some groups didn't get quite to that level, but never mind, they've given enough that can be done, and they were time bound. I think every group considered the deliverable time frame. So in that sense, personally, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the breadth, with the technical content and the knowledge of what came out of the groups. I think, having talked to people who were in the groups, everybody was satisfied with the process of their group. They felt they had a chance to say what they wanted to say. It was listened to. I was very pleased to hear that. And the outcome was very helpful and will greatly assist, and this is the whole point, isn't it, will greatly assist those who ultimately must pull all of these together into a cohesive action plan called GAPAD. And what you have contributed will help to make that task possible. Without your contribution over these 2 days, I don't think it would actually be very easily possible for any group I can think of to take Sustainable Agenda 2030 and distill it to GAPAD without this critical guidance and advice that you are giving as specialists. We are deeply honoured that you've given up your time, each and every one of you, is a valuable contributor, and to have your input is invaluable. So for that, I thank everybody who has worked on this. Those who are the secretaries, from the Q&A, you've had comments, you've had questions, you may have taken the opportunity to tweak and fine-tune your original documentation. Can you please ensure that the final version that you and your group are comfortable with can be made available? And I think, Keith, are you the repository for all of these? Keith? As the rapporteur for the conference, you are the one who should receive the refined version, please. So can I ask each of the secretaries to please don't go home without ensuring that the final version goes to the conference rapporteur. For those who were the presenters, the press would like to talk with you and interview you, so can you please make yourself available to them? Hands up those who are from the press. So, at the back, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so they're the guys, please look for them. They'd like to talk to you and interview you, please. For the remainder, please let's go out, stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee. When we come back, we're changing the program a little because I didn't want to cut short the Q&A session for the presentations. When we come back, we will have an hour, and the format for that, I will actually exit the podium and I'm going to hand this over to Syed. And Syed will give you a presentation, a short presentation on the way forward and the process, and then it will be, and I'm sure it will be a sufficiently interactive period over that 1 hour so that we can have your collective thoughts. I did want to just explain that there was a query with the group working on target 2.5. And we talked about it, and I gave them an explanation that I haven't given to everybody else about what happens with GAPAD. Like, how does GAPAD become an instrument? Now, Syed will tease this out, an instrument of influence. Syed will tease this out, but in essence, what you have created will feed into a process that will involve people of sufficient I use the word gravitas, reputation, expertise and experience, people who are unquestionable credibility and their supporting staffs. And they will, through a process that is yet to be determined, but I envisage will involve a number of meetings, probably in different geographies, they will distill your inputs from each of the roundtables into a cohesive and integrated document that will be GAPAD. Now, we may have a phased approach of this because there's a lot, isn't there? There's a long-term sort of plan. It would just be as much as saying we have no intention of endeavouring to achieve SDA 2030, and it will go nowhere. And the groups were mindful of that. And nobody did that. The groups came back with recommendations that were clearly related to SDA 2030 targets, demonstrably related, relevant. The things that have been brought forward, I was very pleased to see, were specific, they were measurable, thought was given and discussion was pulled out whether they were achievable. We pointed out who was responsible in some groups didn't get quite to that level, but never mind, they've given enough that can be done, and they were time bound. I think every group considered the deliverable time frame. In that sense, personally, I'm impressed. I'm impressed with the breadth, with the technical content and the knowledge of what came out of the groups. I think, having talked to people who were in the groups, everybody was satisfied with the process of their group. They felt they had a chance to say what they wanted to say. It was listened to. I was very pleased to hear that. And the outcome was very helpful and will greatly assist, and this is the whole point, isn't it, will greatly assist those who ultimately must pull all of these together into a cohesive action plan called GAPAD. And what you have contributed will help to make that task possible. Without your contribution over these 2 days, I don't think it would actually be very easily possible for any group I can think of to take Sustainable Agenda 2030 and distill it to GAPAD without this critical guidance and advice that you are giving as specialists. We are deeply honoured that you've given up your time, each and every one of you, is a valuable contributor, and to have your input is invaluable. So for that, I thank everybody who has worked on this. Those who are the secretaries, from the Q&A, you've had comments, you've had questions, you may have taken the opportunity to tweak and fine-tune your original documentation. Can you please ensure that the final version that you and your group are comfortable with can be made available? And I think, Keith, are you the repository for all of these? Keith? As the rapporteur for the conference, you are the one who should receive the refined version, please. So can I ask each of the secretaries to please don't go home without ensuring that the final version goes to the conference rapporteur. For those who were the presenters, the press would like to talk with you and interview you, so can you please make yourself available to them. Hands up those who are from the press. So, at the back, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so they're the guys, please look for them. They'd like to talk to you and interview you, please. For the remainder, please let's go out, stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee. When we come back, we're changing the program a little because I didn't want to cut short the Q&A session for the presentations. When we come back, we will have an hour, and the format for that, I will actually exit the podium and I'm going to hand this over to Syed. And Syed will give you a presentation, a short presentation on the way forward and the process, and then it will be, and I'm sure it will be a sufficiently interactive period over that 1 hour so that we can have your collective thoughts. I did want to just explain that there was a query with the group working on Target 2.5, and we talked about it, and I gave them an explanation that I haven't given to everybody else about what happens with GAPAD. Like, how does GAPAD become an instrument? Now, Syed will tease this out, an instrument of influence. Syed will tease this out, but in essence, what you have created will feed into a process that will involve people of sufficient, I use the word gravitas, reputation, expertise and experience people who are unquestionable credibility and their supporting staffs. And they will, through a process that is yet to be determined, but I envisage will involve a number of meetings, probably in different geographies, they will distill your inputs from each of the roundtables into a cohesive and integrated document that will be GAPAD. Now, we may have a phased approach of this because there's a lot, isn't there? There's a
When we're talking about resilient agricultural systems and sustainable production systems, we're talking about this in the context of global climate change. And the existing agricultural system is extremely vulnerable. It's vulnerable because there are so few crops and grow in so few locations, and these locations going forward into the future are going to have difficulty producing these very few major crops. So we needed to deliberate on how we could make agricultural systems more resilient. What would we need to do? Were included creating a global agricultural knowledge base. Now, the essence of this is that most of the data we have in the world at the moment relates to very few crops. We know a lot about wheat, rice, maize and soybean. But as we move away from those handful of crops out into the lesser known and underutilized crops, our knowledge of these crops is much, much less. So what we have decided to do, and we've resolved to do here, is to develop an agricultural knowledge base that will have the same depth of knowledge of these lesser used crops, because without that knowledge, investment decisions cannot be made to use these as ingredients. Major companies cannot take the risk of using crops that they don't have that knowledge about. So the global agricultural knowledge base will be an enabling tool that will facilitate these underutilized crops being able to be brought in and used in place of the 4 or up to 6 or 7 major crops.
Agriculture, and particularly agricultural diversification, must play a part in reducing our carbon emissions and particularly meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance poverty. So we proposed an action plan which we called GAPAD, the Global Action Plan for Agricultural Diversification, to address 6 of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So for instance, if I give you an example, energy, how would we diversify agriculture to address the issue of energy? Another one would be life on land. How would we diversify our use of land to address Sustainable Development Goals? So there are 6 goals. This meeting here in Nairobi is to address Sustainable Development Goal 2, which is actually to end hunger and provide nutrition. Now to achieve that, we need to bring together the best minds, the best researchers, the best stakeholders that we can to address the issue of SDG 2, nutrition, and how that will actually achieve the goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda by 2030. So we have GAPAD, we have all those goals, and this particular meeting was about SDG 2, nutrition. We've been looking at how nutrition can be addressed by diversifying agriculture beyond the major crops that we currently depend on.